have a problem that I've been working on ever since I left the Christian faith, with its dogmas and eschatological viewpoints, and readopted the Buddhist way. My dilemma was first driven by fear. That good old Christian warning that if I didn't believe in an afterlife, and by virtue of being Christian, an eternal soul, then I would be relegated to eternal fires and damnation. All fire and brimstone, without a marshmallow in sight. Perhaps now I don't really have a fear per se, but a curiosity. Buddhism teaches anatta, or anatman. There is no permanent, independent, unchanging self or soul. One would think, okay, problem solved. Nothing permanent to burn eternally, no pitchforks to worry about. Except Buddhism also traditionally teaches karma, samsara, and rebirth. And there's the rub. If there's no permanent soul going around collecting bodies like somebody changing rental cars at the airport, then what exactly is being reborn? We could imagine it as pouring tea from one cup into another. It might be a similar cup or an entirely different cup, perhaps even a bowl. Sometimes the tea gets spilled onto the floor, only to be soaked up later by a towel or mop. Regardless of where it lands, the tea seems to remain tea. There's plenty of symbolism we could squeeze out of that little domestic disaster. The container changes while something appears to continue. The spilled tea might represent an unfortunate descent into one of the hell realms, later to be gathered up through the exhaustion of karma, or perhaps through the compassionate intervention of a bodhisattva carrying a particularly large spiritual mop. But there's a problem with my metaphor. Buddhism doesn't actually say there's a mysterious metaphysical liquid called me being poured from one container into another. That would simply be a soul wearing Buddhist clothing. So we're back to the inevitable question. If there is no permanent soul, what is reborn? The problem. Buddhism teaches that there is no permanent, independent, unchanging self or soul. Buddhism also teaches karma, samsara, and rebirth. That much we've covered. At first glance, these teachings appear contradictory. If there is no enduring self, who performs karma? Who experiences its consequences? What passes from one life into another? Remember the cups and the tea? And lastly, who or what is liberated? Does continuity require an enduring entity? The largely Western answer tends to be yes. Buddhism's answer is largely no. And this is where Buddhist philosophy begins doing something quite different from the religious system I grew up with. Christianity, at least in its conventional forms, begins with a person and asks what ultimately happens to that person. Buddhism takes a more unsettling approach. It asks whether the person we're so worried about preserving was ever the kind of thing we imagined it to be in the first place. That changes the question considerably. First, we have to get the aggregate straight. The Buddha analyzed what we conventionally call a human being in terms of 5 aggregates, or skandhas: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These are not precisely the 5 senses, although the sensory faculties and their objects form another closely related Buddhist analysis of experience. Form is the physical dimension. Feeling is the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral tone of experience. Perception recognizes and identifies. Mental formations include intentions, impulses, habits, dispositions, memories, preferences, fears, and all the psychological furniture we've accumulated and apparently refuse to throw away. Consciousness is awareness arising in dependence upon conditions. Nowhere inside these 5 heaps does the Buddha locate an eternal little homunculus sitting behind the eyes operating the machinery. No ghost in the machine. Sorry, Sting. There isn't a tiny Mushin inside Mushin pulling levers. And thank goodness, he would probably demand overtime. Each aggregate changes. The body changes, feelings change, perceptions, thoughts, intentions, consciousness, they all change. Yet, from the interplay of these changing processes arises the very convincing experience of I am. That feeling is real as an experience. Buddhism doesn't deny that. What Buddhism denies is our interpretation of it. We experience a process and conclude that there must therefore be a permanent owner of the process. The Buddha says, look again. A verb pretending to be a noun. One way I've begun to understand anatta is to think of the self less as a thing and more as an activity. We are accustomed to thinking, I am Darren, or I am Mushin, or I am this person who has existed continuously from childhood until now. But consider what that means. The child I was is gone. The teenager I was is gone. The Christian priest I once was is gone. The man I was 10 years ago is gone. Even the person who began writing this essay is microscopically different from the person typing this sentence. Cells have changed. Thoughts have appeared and disappeared. Memories have been recalled. Neurons have fired. Numerous cups of tea have probably entered the equation somewhere along the line. Sencha, to be exact. I'm also accepting donations of sencha if you feel so inclined. Yet, continuity exists. There is clearly a relationship between the 5-year-old child and the man sitting here now. But relationship is not identity. The 5-year-old Darren didn't disappear completely and get replaced by some unrelated stranger. Nor has some immutable 5-year-old soul been sitting untouched inside me for decades. What exists is causal continuity. One state conditions another. This becomes that. This having arisen, that arises. This ceasing, that also ceases. The Buddha. I may therefore be better understood as a verb pretending to be a noun. I am not so much a fixed self as I am an ongoing selfing. That's a strange word. But Buddhism is occasionally a strange business. The flame that lights another flame. A more traditional analogy has to do with fire. Suppose one candle lights another candle. Is the second flame the same flame? No. Is it completely unrelated? Also no. The first flame conditions the arising of the second. There is continuity without numerical identity. Nothing solid jumps between the candles. There isn't a little flame soul packing its bags, moving down the wick and taking up residence next door. Yet causation has occurred. The second flame would not have arisen in precisely that way without the first. This is enormously important to understanding Buddhist rebirth. Rebirth does not require something permanent to travel. It requires conditions to continue producing consequences. And this is where karma enters the discussion. Karma isn't a cosmic accounting department. Western discussions of karma sometimes turn it into a celestial banking system. Do something good, deposit 20 karma points. Do something bad, withdrawal. Cut somebody off in traffic. Apparently you come back as a cockroach. My wife hates cockroaches. My lizard loves them. Help an elderly woman across the street. Perhaps you get upgraded to premium economy on the next incarnation. That isn't quite what Buddhism means. Karma fundamentally means intentional action. Our intentional actions condition us. Repeated actions become habits. Habits become tendencies. Tendencies influence perception. Perception influences future action. And before we know it, we have constructed what feels like a personality. This is why the statement attributed to Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche is so wonderfully Buddhist. When asked what gets reborn if there is no self, he is often paraphrased as answering, mostly your bad habits. Now that's funny. I don't care who you are. Thank you, Larry the Cable Guy. Unfortunately, it's also uncomfortably plausible. Consider what happens during this lifetime. I become angry. I express anger. I rehearse anger. I become slightly more inclined toward anger the next time circumstances arise. Nothing metaphysical needs to travel anywhere. Cause and effect are enough. Yesterday's anger becomes one of the conditions shaping today's mushin. Yesterday's compassion does the same. So does greed. So does generosity. So does fear. So does wisdom. Every intentional act leaves the universe slightly different from how we found it, including the universe inside our own skull. This raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps rebirth shouldn't first be understood as something that happens after death. Perhaps we ought to begin with something much closer. Rebirth is happening constantly. The person who woke up this morning is not precisely the person reading these words now. The one reading them now is much more congenial. You've encountered things. You've thought things. Your body has changed. Your nervous system has changed. Some cells have died. Others have divided. You may have learned something. You may have forgotten something. You may even have changed your mind. Miracles do happen. Zen sometimes speaks very naturally from this immediate perspective. Birth and death are occurring moment by moment. Thought arises, thought disappears. Emotion arises, emotion disappears. Identity arises, identity disappears. We cling to continuity and draw a line through all of these events, me. But perhaps that line exists mostly because we drew it, often with our own feet as we are dragged along, painfully. Then what about death? And here we reach the uncomfortable part. Moment-to-moment rebirth is philosophically tidy. It's psychologically observable. It fits nicely with dependent origination. But traditional Buddhism goes further. It speaks of rebirth after bodily death. The Buddha describes past lives. The Jaka literature presents accounts of previous births. Traditional Buddhist cosmology contains human, animal, heavenly, hellish, hungry ghost, and other modes of existence. We shouldn't pretend those teachings aren't there simply because they make modern Western Buddhists uncomfortable. They are there. The interesting question is how they coexist with anatta. Classical Buddhism generally rejects two extremes. The first is eternalism. There is an eternal self that survives death unchanged. The second is annihilationism. A truly existing self lives during this lifetime and is utterly destroyed at death. Notice something peculiar. Both views assume the same thing. They assume there was a permanent self there to begin with. The eternalist says it continues. The annihilationist says it stops. Buddhism says, you've already misunderstood the situation. There was never an independent permanent entity there whose continued existence or annihilation needed to be explained. There was dependent arising. Not the same, not another. This formulation appears repeatedly in Buddhist philosophical discussions. What continues is neither exactly the same nor completely different. Consider yourself at age 10. Are you the same person? Yes. Are you literally the same? No. Your body is different. Your mind is different. Your beliefs are different. Your knowledge is different. Your haircut is probably different. Mine is bald. Hopefully your fashion sense is different. Yet the present person stands in causal continuity with that child. That child's actions helped create this adult. The child and adult are neither identical nor unrelated. Buddhist rebirth extends that logic beyond the boundary we call death. Whether we accept that extension literally is another question. But philosophically, the mechanism doesn't require an immortal soul. It requires causal continuity. The river is never the same river. A river provides another useful analogy. We name it the Chattahoochee, the Mississippi, the Ganges, the Nile. Yesterday we stood beside the river. Today we return and call it by the same name. Yet yesterday's water has moved downstream. New water has arrived. Sediment has shifted. Fish have moved. Branches have fallen. The river exists. But where exactly is the permanent river? Take away the water. Take away the banks, take away gravity, take away rainfall, take away tributaries, take away the terrain. Where is the river? There is no independent river apart from the conditions producing what we conventionally call river. Human beings are much the same. We are rivers with opinions. Some of us are particularly opinionated rivers. So who receives the karma? This question begins to dissolve once we stop demanding an owner. Who receives the consequence of yesterday's actions? Today's person does. Is today's person exactly the same as yesterday's? No. Is today's person unrelated? Certainly not. That's enough for moral responsibility. I don't need an eternal soul to explain why drinking excessively tonight might leave tomorrow morning's mushin feeling miserable. Tomorrow morning's mushin will not be molecularly identical to tonight's mushin. Many more sencha T molecules. But I assure you he will feel sufficiently connected to lodge a complaint. The same principle applies to ethical action. Actions propagate consequences through causal systems. They shape minds. They shape families. They shape societies. They shape environments. They shape whatever conditions come afterward. Karma doesn't require an eternal recipient any more than knocking over the first domino requires one eternal domino to travel down the line. The pattern continues. Thus, but is that really rebirth? Here I have to admit something. I really have no idea, and I'm becoming increasingly more comfortable admitting that. I don't know what happens when biological death occurs. Neither my ordination nor my robes came with backstage passes to the universe. I just look like I know. Spree Ted, I was concentrating really hard on looking holy. Father Ted analogy, if anyone recognizes it. Gotta love Dougal. What I do know is that Buddhism gives me a philosophical model in which continuity doesn't require permanence. That matters. It allows me to consider rebirth without smuggling an eternal soul through the back door. Perhaps traditional rebirth is literally true. Perhaps consciousness participates in causal processes we don't yet understand. Perhaps the classical cosmological language contains symbolic dimensions alongside literal ones. Perhaps rebirth is simultaneously moment-to-moment, psychological, relational, karmic, and cosmological. I don't presently have sufficient evidence to nail the lid shut on any of those boxes. And frankly, Zen has taught me to be suspicious of boxes, especially very well-labeled ones. Keep your hands to yourself, Pandora. What the Buddha seems more concerned about. What I find striking is that Buddhist practice doesn't require me to settle the entire metaphysical problem before sitting down. I breathe, I observe. Thought arises, thought passes. Anger arises, anger passes. Fear arises, fear passes. The person defending his identity arises. He passes too. I can watch anatta happening, not as philosophy, not as dogma, as experience. I cannot presently sit on a cushion and directly demonstrate my next lifetime. But I can demonstrate impermanence before breakfast. I can demonstrate dependent arising before lunch. I can observe craving creating suffering by dinner. By bedtime, I've usually produced enough empirical evidence to keep the Buddha's research department fully funded. That's one reason Buddhism ultimately appealed to me after leaving Christianity. I became less interested in being told what I had to believe about another world and more interested in examining what could be discovered in this one. That doesn't mean I arrogantly declare everything beyond measurement impossible. It means I'm willing to say, I don't know. There is tremendous freedom in those three words. Nirvana complicates things even further. Then somebody inevitably asks, if nobody exists, who attains nirvana? Welcome back to the problem. But Buddhism isn't saying nobody exists. It says nobody exists independently and permanently. Now that's different. Conventional persons exist. You exist. I exist. The Buddha existed. Our suffering certainly seems to exist. The mistake occurs when we take conventional existence and transform it into metaphysical permanence. Nirvana isn't an immortal soul finally winning the cosmic lottery. It is the extinguishing of greed, hatred, and delusion. The word itself carries the imagery of a flame going out. What disappears? Not some metaphysical person. The fuel disappears. Craving, grasping, and ignorance ceases, and when the causes of suffering cease, suffering no longer arises in the same manner. Again, when this arises, that arises. When this ceases, that ceases. Perhaps Trungpa wasn't joking. So now I return to that wonderfully irritating statement. What gets reborn? Mostly your bad habits. Perhaps Trungpa wasn't merely being clever. Maybe he was pointing directly toward dependent origination. What we call a person is in large part a collection of conditioned tendencies continuously reconstructing itself. I like this. I dislike that. I want this. I fear that. I am this sort of person. I would never do that. She always does this. He always does that. We narrate ourselves into existence all day long, and then we suffer because reality refuses to follow the script. Perhaps rebirth is the persistence of conditioning. Perhaps liberation is what happens when conditioning is finally seen clearly enough that we stop mistaking it for an owner. Suddenly, the joke becomes a teaching, which, in my experience, is usually what happens with good Buddhist humor. First you laugh, then several hours later you think, damn it. The tea was never the point. So let's return one last time to our cups and tea. Maybe the analogy wasn't completely useless. Maybe I was simply looking at the wrong part. I imagined something substantial, the tea, moving between containers. But dependent origination may be closer to one cup tipping another, which tips another, which tips another. Nothing permanent travels through the sequence. Yet every event conditions the next. Or perhaps one flame lights another, or one wave produces conditions for the next wave. The waves aren't identical. There is no permanent wave essence running down the ocean, yet the movement continues. Maybe what Buddhism calls rebirth isn't the migration of an object. Maybe it is the continuation of a process. That process doesn't belong to anyone. It simply unfolds according to causes and conditions. And suddenly our original question changes. Instead of asking, what thing gets reborn? Perhaps Buddhism invites us to ask, what conditions continue? That is a very different question. Where I currently stand. I no longer fear that rejecting an eternal soul means I'm destined for eternal barbecue. That particular anxiety has largely burned itself out. Pun intended. Neither do I feel obligated to replace the Christian soul with a Buddhist version carrying different paperwork. If Buddhism teaches anatta, then I think we ought to take the teaching seriously. No permanent self. No metaphysical pearl hidden somewhere inside the aggregates. No eternal mushin waiting to change costumes after death. But I also don't think intellectual honesty requires me to declare rebirth impossible. I simply have to distinguish continuity from identity. That distinction seems to resolve much of the apparent contradiction. Something can continue without remaining the same thing. We see that everywhere. In rivers, in flames, in ecosystems, in cultures, in families, in bodies, in minds, and in ourselves. The Darren who entered Christianity was not precisely the Darren who left it. The Darren who returned to Buddhism was not precisely the Darren who had practiced Buddhism decades earlier. The novice writing this today will not be precisely the novice who wakes up tomorrow morning, yet each arose dependent upon the one before. No permanent soul required, just conditions. Just consequences, just this becoming that, again and again and again, until perhaps one day the machinery of grasping finally runs out of fuel. And then, I don't know. Maybe the Buddha was wise enough to leave some questions unanswered because answering them would merely give us one more idea to cling to. For now, I sit, I breathe. I watch one mushin disappear and another arise, thousands of times. Sometimes the next one is a little wiser. Sometimes he's just hungry. And occasionally, on a particularly good day, he remembers that neither one was ever quite as permanent as he thought.